Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Alaska Forum on the Environment virtual technical session. It is 11 o'clock by my clock, so we'll go ahead and get started this morning. My name is Jessie Moen. I'm an entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service, and I'll be helping to moderate this morning's session. Through today's virtual presentation format, you'll be able to hear the presenter and myself. If you have any questions, please do feel free to type those into the Q&A pod. It's on the right side of your video player within your event interface, and these will be relayed to the presenters. Today's session will be the last AFE technical session until the beginning of August, so that folks can take some time to enjoy their Alaska summer. So please do mark your calendars and rejoin us on August 4th to learn about fungi. So today, though, we're going to hear about Alaska's changing wildfire environment. Today's speaker is Zav Grabinski. Zav is the Science Communication Specialist with the Alaska Fire Science Consortium at UAF. Originally from Fairbanks, Zav received a master's in natural resources from Humboldt State University. His background includes geospatial and visual modeling of fire interactions on landscapes, regional scale data analysis of drought impacts on forests, and website development and design. Currently, Zav is interested in communicating complex biophysical processes to diverse audiences using modern visualization techniques and digital media formats. I'm really looking forward to learning more about fire and what you're working on. So with that, Zav, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to present for the Alaska Forum on the Environment. The University of Alaska Fairbanks Trothieta campus is in the homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene. I acknowledge the ancestral and present land stewardship and place-based knowledge of Alaska Native peoples. Today, I'd like to share a broad overview of wildfire in Alaska within the context of a rapidly changing climate. The presentation is based off a public outreach handbook published by the Alaska Fire Science Consortium and the International Arctic Research Center. The report was authored by myself and Heather McFarland with significant help from researchers at UAF and especially the Interagency wildfire management community. This is a fire-specific follow-up to the 2019 outreach publication, Alaska's Changing Environment. I'd like to start by introducing the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. If you've never heard of us, we are a small organization housed at UAF's International Arctic Research Center. We work closely with land managers and researchers to help bridge the gap in Boreal and Arctic fire science, delivery, outreach, and application. We provide products and services including seasonal workshops and trainings, webinars and videos, fire science highlights, proposal support and collaboration, consultation by subject matter experts, and direct support for Alaska Wildland Fire Coordinating Group. The Alaska Fire Science Consortium is one of 15 regional consortia supported by the Joint Fire Science Program. It's part of a national fire science knowledge exchange network. As part of this network, AFSC works to strengthen connections between fire science research and on-the-ground application. Today, I am joined by the AFSC coordinator, Allison York, who will be assisting with any questions. Please type your questions into the chat as they arise, and they will be addressed during section breaks in the presentation. Now that you know a little bit about us, I'd like to jump into Alaska's changing wildfire. The landscape of Alaska presents many unique opportunities and challenges. Alaska is the largest state with the lowest population density, the most public land, and complete isolation from the continental United States. Wildfire is a natural process in Alaska and provides complex ecological effects. In the context of a rapidly changing environment, understanding emerging trends in wildfire compared to previous decades can help us better prepare for what wildfire may look like in the future. Alaska utilizes specific fire management tools to meet its unique needs. Alaska fire managers partner with scientists to improve the scientific basis for management responses to changes in fire and climate conditions. These include developing applications of remotely sensed data, evaluating the effectiveness of fuel treatments, and obtaining the most accurate geospatial data for decision support. In today's presentation, I will provide a high-level summary of the seasonal phases of fire, wildfire management trends and impacts, science applications, and preparing for wildfire. There are free printed copies of the report that this presentation is based on. You can email me at zav.grabinski@alaska.edu or read the report online on AFSC's webpage. All the figures from the report are packaged and are easy to reuse. Area burned by wildfire varies tremendously from year to year. Factors such as temperature, drought, and earlier snowmelt contribute to this variation. Most of these fires occur in the interior boreal forest between the Alaska and Brooks mountain ranges. Despite variability from season to season, evidence suggests that wildfire is burning more acres and expanding into new areas of the state. The increasing area burned, along with fires that are more frequent, survive over winter, or reburn the same location after just a few years, are consistent with the predicted effects of climate change. This has statewide implications, including increased fire risks for people, property, and resources. This is a more detailed version of the same graph. You can see above normal fire years are becoming much more common. The past 20 years have experienced a clear shift towards more frequent large fire seasons. Although years with relatively few burned acres are still common, this variability is due to many factors such as precipitation, climate, and lightning occurrence. Even when it is a relatively small fire year in Alaska, looking more broadly at other Arctic and boreal regions gives a clear impression that more land is burning as the Arctic rapidly warms. I'd like to take a quick look beyond Alaska at the most recent circumpolar trends in fire. If we look at satellite detections of fire in the far north, we can see that large fires are very common in Russia and Canada. This is a circumpolar image from the 2020 NOAA Arctic Report Card, Wildland Fire in High Northern Latitudes. The more central dotted line represents the Arctic Circle, and we can see that there is significant fire activity since 2001 as fire spreads further from its historic ranges. Although 2020 was one of the wettest Alaskan summers on record, it was actually the largest fire year in the far north at a circumpolar scale, as you can see illustrated by the graphic of fire detection within the Arctic Circle. The main driver of the 2020 fire year was fires in Sakha, Siberia, many which had reignited from overwintering fires from the previous year. With that quick global perspective, let's focus back in on Alaska and look specifically at the seasonality of fire. The Alaska fire season, particularly in the interior region of the state, can be explained by 4 phases. Fire season begins in April, typically before full green up when the below ground soil is still frozen. The most readily available fuels are dead grasses and surface litter. With these limited fuels, wind is the key driver of fire activity. Fire can spread and grow rapidly, but usually with low severity because it cannot burn deeply into the moist and frozen duff. These seasonal phases have been widely used by the management community for over 40 years to describe the fire season. I will review these seasonal phases first to help give context and better understand emerging trends in wildfire across Alaska, which are examined later. Alaska snowpack now develops nearly 2 weeks earlier in spring compared to the late 1990s. This trend is pushing the fire season earlier into the year, as well as extending the fire season later into the fall. Early season fire is often the result of human-caused ignitions when outdoor recreational activities and debris burning lead to unintentional fire starts. These preventable fires are usually close to communities and receive aggressive suppression response, so typically they don't get very large. This National Interagency Fire Center data set shows that in Alaska, more fires are started by humans than lightning in most years. These human-caused fires are closer to communities and are typically highest priority for suppression. Although the number of human and lightning ignitions are comparable, lightning ignitions burn far more acres than human-caused fires each year. Lightning-ignited fires are often in areas of limited suppression and more difficult to reach locations. In most years, and all years with substantial fire seasons, the majority of acres burned are caused by lightning ignitions. These fires are often in remote locations where managers can allow fires to serve their ecological role without directly impacting life or property. On average, nearly 60,000 lightning strikes occur in interior Alaska each summer. As you can see from the graph on the right, the interior receives by far the most lightning. Although lightning data from before 1999 are limited due to sparse sensor coverage, modeling methods reveal long-term lightning trends. Over the past 30 years, June and July lightning activity has increased by about 17%. Increase in temperature and precipitation are associated with increased lightning frequency, which we have definitely been seeing. Lightning is most common during the duff-driven phase. Currently, we are in the middle of peak fire season that is driven by long days around solstice, which dry out subsurface fuels, known as duff, that can be ignited by lightning. Duff is a key differentiating characteristic of fire in boreal forests. Just below the ground surface, there are slowly decomposing organic materials mixed with soils that can become very dry and spread fire across long distances. Fire activity may greatly increase in June as long sunny days quickly dry out these duff fuels. Fires occurring during this period are characterized by sudden growth events related to hot, dry, sunny days and can produce high flammability despite green vegetation. These peak season fires can quickly become uncontrollable. Recently in the media, overwintering or holdover fires have received a lot of attention. These are fires that smolder underground in the duff and can reignite in the future, sometimes even after an entire winter. Here is an aerial view of an overwintering fire in Alaska. You can see smoke rising from the duff at labels A. And interestingly, at B, you can see fallen trees that still have green needles, and this is somewhat rare. The fallen trees are likely due to root damage from underground burning. Although these overwintering fires are more frequent and have received a lot of attention lately, even being called zombie fires, they are not a new occurrence. A great historical example of an overwintering fire dates back to 1941 and 42 in the Tanana Flats south of Fairbanks. In 1941, steam engines ran the Alaska Railroad we know today and had to dump their ash pans frequently. In fact, they had fire guards, college students mostly, hired to ride the trains and watch for fire starts to extinguish them. Agency personnel in Alaska think we are seeing more of these holdover fires as summers get longer, hotter, and sometimes drier. This creates better conditions for fires to burn deep into the mossy forest floor and be protected from rain and snow during the winter. For example, 3 of 2019's most significant fires in 3 different areas of the state, including Fairbanks, Mat-Su, and Kenai, all spawned holdover fires early in 2020. You can read more about these fires described by AFSC subject matter expert Randy Jant in a new Nature article, Overwintering Fires in Boreal Forests. Or for some lighter reading, check out our fire science blog, akfiresciencehighlights.com, and check out the zombie fires of 1942. Okay, let's go back to the seasonal fire phases of Alaska and look at some of the climatic conditions that drive fire throughout the duff-driven phase into the drought-driven phase. Alaska is getting hotter fast. Summer temperatures across Alaska have been increasing since 1970. A typical summer nowadays is close to what the warmest summers were prior to the 1970s. When comparing the average June to August temperatures over the last 95 years, 9 of the 10 warmest summers occurred in the past 20 years, whereas the 10 coldest summers all occurred before 1975. The number of days that can reach 77 Fahrenheit per year has increased substantially since the 20th century, and they are predicted to become much more frequent in the future. Very hot weather like this can result in days or weeks where fire may be impossible to suppress and can grow rapidly. We can measure the flammability of fuels with a measure called the buildup index. In this graphic, we can see that across the globe at high latitudes, there's a tremendous increase in the flammability of fuels from 1979 to 2019, with some extreme hotspots occurring north of Fairbanks in the Yukon flats. As we move into July, if temperatures remain high and precipitation low, drought can extend and expand the fire season, as we have especially seen in recent years. Let's take a look at precipitation. There is a great deal of annual variability in precipitation. However, in the last 20 years, we have seen significantly more rainfall in the interior. Research indicates that precipitation would have to increase by about 7 to 10% in intensity per degree of temperature increase to offset the increased fuel drying due to warming temperatures. So even though we are getting more rain, it may not be enough to keep up with rising temperatures. Precipitation has been increasing with regional variability across Alaska. As precipitation increases, so does lightning. Based off this normalized data from 2020, UAF researchers show that we are seeing significant increase in lightning strikes in many regions of the state. So even though we are getting more precipitation, temperature increase combined with more frequent lightning may be contributing to an increase in fire occurrence. Precipitation matters, especially for late season fire events. Let's look at a specific fire, the McKinley wildfire, that occurred north of Wasilla. 2019 had the lowest ever recorded precipitation for the region. This incredibly devastating fire occurred in the second half of August, well after typical peak fire season. Okay, let's take one last look at the seasonal phases of fire in Alaska and consider how the season closes towards the end of August. Cooler nighttime temperatures normally slow fire activity. This is known as the diurnal effect. However, daily low temperatures are increasing. Alaska experiences many more warm nights compared to the early part of the 20th century. This is especially true for interior communities like Fairbanks. The 5 summers with the warmest nights all occurred in the past 20 years, whereas the 5 summers with the coldest nights all occurred before 1950. Fire season in Alaska is typically pushed to a lower solar radiation. As nighttime temperatures drop and relative humidity increases, fire has difficulty spreading. The past 2 decades, however, have included notable late season fire events related to relatively high temperatures and low precipitation in August. Alaska's wildfire season is getting longer. Over the past 40 years, the first large fire of the season starts earlier and the last large fire of the season starts later. Since 2006, Alaska's official fire season has started on April 1st, 1 month earlier. This reduces accidental ignitions by requiring permits in order to burn debris and allows agencies to begin training personnel and allocating resources earlier. In busy fire seasons, such as 2019, the fire season may be extended into the fall. Now that we have a better understanding of the seasonality of fires in Alaska, we can better understand what is driving the increase in fire size in Alaska. But before we look at the emerging patterns, let's first take a break to answer any questions, and then we will look at how wildfire is managed in Alaska.
Hey, Zav and Allison. We have two great questions in the chat from Elia Epchuk. The first is, does the chart of wildfires that you shared include controlled burning? And then the second question is, would global warming be a cause of increased lightning strikes?
Great, thanks for the questions. I'll give my response, then Allison can correct me or improve my answer. So for the first two charts I showed, the acres burned of wildfires, those charts typically do include controlled burning. It's easy to filter them out, but proportionately, they're so small, it doesn't really affect the data trends or how the graphs look at all.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. Most of the controlled burning that has happened in Alaska is by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to enhance wildlife habitat, and then also a limited amount of burning on military lands, on range lands, to reduce ignition risk. But yeah, compared to the natural starts, it's really very, very small percentage.
Great. And then the second question, would global warming be a cause of increased lightning strikes? Yes, absolutely. As the temperature increases, the air holds more moisture and precipitation becomes more common, and you begin to get more lightning. And that's what we've definitely been seeing over the last couple decades.
Yeah, exactly. There are multiple studies recently showing that lightning is increasing, particularly in the far north and in areas of Alaska where we're seeing the greatest temperature increase, such as the North Slope. We're seeing really significant increases in lightning because of course those were areas where there was relatively little lightning because of the cool temperatures and the maritime influence. Now, as those areas are becoming warmer, the amount of lightning is increasing proportionally very much. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thanks for those answers.
Yeah, great questions. Hope to keep them coming as the presentation continues. Okay, let's take a look at wildfire management in Alaska. 3 wildland fire protection agencies are responsible for fire suppression across the entire 375 million acres of Alaska. The Bureau of Land Management, Alaska Fire Service, the Alaska Division of Forestry, and the U.S. Forest Service have primary authority to organize fire suppression operations within their respective regions. The protecting agencies work together under the Alaska Master Cooperative Wildland Fire Management and Stafford Act Agreement to coordinate wildland fire management efforts efficiently. The interagency fire management in Alaska is remarkable. Alaska's fire protection strategy is determined by the Alaska Interagency Fire Management Plan. The state is divided into 4 categories of protection: critical, full, modified, and limited. These management zones are determined by landowner and reevaluated annually. Managers prioritize their initial response to new fires based on these zones, and the firefighting resources. As you can see, the most critical areas of protection are around communities. The majority of the state is categorized as areas of limited suppression, where wildfire can promote ecological benefit by being allowed to burn freely. Wildfire in Alaska is unlike anywhere else in the United States. The ability to allow fire to fulfill its natural role in remote areas affords important ecological benefits and limits the buildup of fuels, which has proven to be a large problem in more populated areas of the United States. Alaska relies on seasonal wildland firefighters. For example, during 2020, the BLM Alaska Fire Service awarded 3 contracts for Type 2 wildland firefighting hand crews based in rural Alaska villages. These crews offer new opportunities and more stable employment for village-based crews, since they are able to work outside of fire suppression on projects such as fuel reduction and others. Okay, with a quick look at wildfire management in Alaska, we can move on to the emerging trends in wildfire. This would actually be a good chance to address the last 2 questions in the chat.
Great, thank you. The first question from Karen Plotnikoff is, all these factors seem to build on each other: warm days, warm nights, changes in precipitation, etc. Is that measurable?
Yeah, so all of those individual factors are quite measurable, and then the interaction between them is of course much more complex, and we do have some great total system modelers that kind of bring all of these together to create prediction forecasts, and UAF is involved with some of those. Maybe Alison can expand on some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. But actually, I'd like to talk first a little bit about and I think you're going to talk about this later in the talk, that the fire management community themselves use integrated indices that in fact incorporate all of these factors, so temperature, precipitation, etc., into weather-based indices that help predict fire danger. So when you're driving down the road and you see those, fire danger is extreme today signs, those are actually based on indices that the fire management community uses to estimate fire danger and fuel flammability. And I think Zav's going to show a couple of data sources about those kind of indices. Yes, but yes, those are things that are getting put together in global scale models to try to measure the impact of climate change on wildland fire. Absolutely. And then I think there's one more, right?
Yeah, why don't you take a shot at this one, Alison? The
Okay.
question is, if I wanted to prove a local-born theory on global warming and the possible global warming reduction, who would I get in touch with?
What a great question. Where I would actually start is with the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, ACAP. Which is a unit at the University of Alaska Fairbanks that works with Alaska communities to help them understand and adapt to a changing climate. So I'm going to put the name and email address of Tina Buxbaum, who's their program manager, in the chat, and that's where I would start, and she can refer you to other people who are interested in those topics.
Thank you for those great answers and for the resources for the Climate and Policy Center as well. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. No problem.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, let's move on to the emerging wildfire. This animation compares total acres burned across 3 20-year time periods. From 2001 to 2020, wildfire in Alaska burned 31.4 million acres, over 2.5 times more acres burned than during the previous 2 decades. Fewer and fewer places in interior Alaska are untouched by wildfire. Fire occurs in Alaska predominantly between the Alaska and Brooks Range, where warm summers, low precipitation, frequent lighting, and black spruce-dominated ecosystems contribute to frequent and large fire. However, we are seeing trends of fire moving outside of this zone into the tundra and coastal regions. For example, the Anatuvik River fire of 2007. This fire doubled the total area burned of Alaska's North Slope since the 1960s and consumed more than 250,000 acres. Notably, the fire was most active in September. If you want to learn more about the Anatuvik River fire, the BLM just released a 10-year report looking at the impacts of the fire. Increased fire activity in the far north is of special interest because of the carbon stored in permafrost. Frozen permafrost holds an estimated 1,400 gigatons of carbon. This amount of carbon is greater than what is currently in the atmosphere. Wildfires release the stored carbon to the atmosphere by removing the duff and soil layers that insulate permafrost, accelerating its thaw. Thawed permafrost can cause surface water to drain, resulting in drier and more flammable duff. As permafrost thaws, it releases more methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, setting up an amplifying feedback to climate warming. One driver of larger fires in the tundra may be increased vegetation growth. Satellite data estimates greenness by measuring the light reflected by plants. In the tundra, high measures of greening are associated with increase of ground vegetation and potentially more fuel available for wildfires. Since 1981, North Slope tundra has significantly greened. 2019 was a remarkable fire year. The Swan Lake fire burned during an unusual lightning storm during very hot and dry conditions. This fire shattered the previous record for suppression cost at an estimated $49 million. This deep burning fire even ignited 2 separate fires in 2020 through overwintering fire. The 21st century has had incredibly large fires. The Taylor Complex fire in 2004 was one of the largest fires ever in the United States, burning about 1.3 million acres and was part of a record-breaking 6.6 million acres burned in total in 2004. Let's visualize area burned by decade in another way. Compare the total acres burned per decade to the total area of the state. The red circles show the proportion of Alaska relative to the size of the state that burned in each decade. 2001 to 2010 marked the largest decade of fire on record, with nearly 20 million acres burned, amounting to over 5% of the total area of Alaska burned in a 10-year period. Without a doubt, 5% of the total state burned in 10 years is a lot. But let's zoom in to a particularly fire-prone region, the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. In the past 60 years, wildfire burned over 8 million acres and touched 64% of the refuge at least once. Wetlands along the Yukon River are the least affected by fire. In addition to increased area burned, reburn fires in Alaska are happening more frequently. This is possibly indicating a shift to a shorter fire return interval. Fire suppression personnel may no longer be able to rely on recently burned areas as effective barriers to new fire growth as they have in the past. Since 1980, over 1,500 fires burned in areas that had already burned during the previous 20 years. The acres burned annually by these reburn fires significantly increased in the early 2000s, as illustrated here. You can see the reburn locations here on the right. Let's take a quick look at the Yukon Flats again for a finer scale examination of reburns. Here, the orange and red shades represent areas that have burned at least twice within 20 years since 1980. Since then, 29 fires burned in areas of the Yukon Flats that had already burned during the past 20 years. Some areas may have burned up to 4 times. With more wildfires, black spruce forests are expected to shift to grasslands or other deciduous forests like aspen and birch. new research shows that deciduous forests can store up to 5 times more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than black spruce forests. This may partially offset the carbon released by wildfires in boreal forests. A reburn occurs when fire impacts the spot burned previously, whereas fire return interval is the time between fires that occur within a relatively small geographic area. One way to approximate the fire return interval is to compare how the percentage of a region burned changes over time, as shown in this graphic. We can see that the fire return interval varies regionally in Alaska. Wildfire is occurring more frequently in recent decades in the central and eastern interior, as well as parts of western Alaska. On the Seward Peninsula, the fire frequency is decreasing, which may be related to more active fire suppression efforts compared to the 1940s to 60s. Okay, let's shift our focus to the impacts of wildfire. The impacts of wildfire on people and wildlife are complex. Some effects, such as infrastructure damage, loss of life and injury, fire suppression costs, and health problems, are trackable. Other effects, such as habitat change, impacts to hunting and fishing, and public anxiety, are difficult to document. Alaskans are especially vulnerable to wildfire impacts, with an estimated 80% of the population living in areas at risk of wildfire. One such example of living in the wildland-urban interface is the McKinley community. Here, you can see the orange fire perimeter is along the Parks Highway, where nearly all of the structures of the McKinley community are located. We can track some of the fire impacts like structures lost, suppression costs, but the mental health effects on residents are much harder to document. One of the most prevalent wildfire impacts is smoke. As the frequency of large wildfire seasons has increased, so has the number of smoky days, posing a significant health hazard. Wildfire smoke is particularly hazardous because it contains particles small enough to travel deep into lungs and bloodstream. This can cause serious lung and heart problems. During active wildfire seasons, smoke particulates are the dominant source of airborne particles in interior Alaska. Beyond public health, smoke can limit visibility to the point where air travel is not possible, disproportionately affecting rural areas serviced only by plane or boat. The Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation helps manage smoke-related health risks by providing near real-time air quality advisories, regional air quality forecasts, and recommendations for safety precautions and activity levels. This graphic depicts days with less than 6 miles of visibility reported at the Fairbanks Airport. Prior to 2004, Fairbanks had only one summer with more than 3 weeks of significant smoke. Since 2004, prolonged smoke episodes have occurred 5 times, including twice since 2014. Smoke is a less frequent problem in Anchorage, but 2019 was by far the smokiest summer on record. Okay, on to fish and wildlife. Many wildlife species depend on wildfire to maintain habitat diversity. Impacts to fish and wildlife depend on the species, time of year, location, vegetation burned, and the severity and extent of the fire. These interactions are incredibly complex, and here are a few examples. In summer, moose can benefit from the shade and predator protection of birch and aspen that grow after high severity fire, and in winter, highly desirable willow is often available for foraging after low severity fire. Another example is that while wintering caribou avoid burns over lichen, burns along migration routes can sometimes be beneficial. And as far as rivers and wildfire go, wildfires that reduce shade over rivers can cause water temperatures to rise, which can impact fish, aquatic plants, and insects. These are just a few examples of the complex relationships between fire and wildlife. Wildfire also has complex interactions with forest pests and disease. In 2019, the US Forest Service surveyed about 25 million acres of Alaska forests by plane, finding over 1 million acres of damage from insects, disease, declines, and other factors. In this graph, we can see the huge increase in spruce bark beetle damage from 2015 to 2018. It's not on the graph, but in 2019, only 150,000 acres of dead or dying spruce was found. This is down considerably from the last 2 years. However, this does not indicate the problem is going away. Rather, this decrease in acreage is likely due to fewer live remaining trees. The outbreak is still ongoing and expanding in nearly all directions from previously affected forests. Spruce beetles are native to Alaska. When in low numbers, they prefer old, slow-growing, or injured trees. But during outbreaks, they will infest trees as small as 6 inches in diameter. This can lead to the accumulation of dead trees and limbs on the ground, which can result in large woody fuel loads. As trees died from a beetle outbreak on the Kenai Peninsula, grass has expanded into formerly forested areas, forming dense mats of dry grass, which can rapidly carry surface fires. Finally, don't forget that fire scars make for excellent. Make sure to stay safe from potential fire and post-fire hazards, such as fragile standing dead trees. Okay, we're on to the next section now, and I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, so I will continue on. Alaska's fire managers partner with scientists to improve the scientific basis for management responses to changes in fire and climate conditions. Remote sensing is especially important in Alaska with tremendous amounts of remote land. Satellite fire detection has proven to be an enormous asset in quickly detecting fire ignitions. VIIRS is a polar orbiting satellite that has coarse resolution imagery, but has a high passover frequency, resulting in rapid, valuable fire detection capability. Researchers work with managers to build tools that will help with wildfire management. One such example is an in-development tool from the EPSCoR Boreal Fires team that uses the VIIRS sensor to provide low and high intensity near real-time fire detection. Here is an example of fire detections produced from Shovel Creek. Detections like these have direct application to spotting residual fire hazards, which can help with resource prioritization. From this graphic, you can see the large variability in frequency of detections, which is mostly related to variations in temperature and wind. Another example of remote sensing tool with fire management use is this recently released daily snow cover extent mapping product. This satellite multi-sensor can differentiate between snow, ice, water, and snow-free ground with high levels of accuracy. If you look at the animation, you can see the different pace at which snow melts depending on the year. Snow-free dates have large implications for the start of fire season. One of the best ways to protect Alaska communities from wildfire is by creating fuel breaks between populated areas and wildlands. This is UAV footage from the Shovel Creek fuel, which proved to be a great tactical asset in protecting the surrounding community. Evidence from a cooperative project led by UAF shows that fuel breaks can provide an incredibly cost-effective tool for fire suppression. For example, when fuel breaks were tested by the Funny River, Card Street, and Nenana Ridge fires, treated areas had less intense surface fires. Fuel breaks also helped expand the tactical options that managers can use on fires near communities, as was shown by the 2010 Eagle Trail and 2019 Shovel Creek and Swan Lake fires. Shaded fuel breaks in boreal black forests may reduce fire potential for over 14 years by reducing canopy density and ladder fuels. A UAF study showed that when these fuel treatments are present on public lands, nearby homeowners are more willing to spend time and money on improving their own defensible spaces. Prescribed fires, a form of fuel break, are an important fire management strategy. Carefully planned burns can help expand the space between communities and Alaska's expansive flammable forests. One study found that every dollar spent on the Kenai-Funny River fuel break equated to $165 saved in protected structures. Along the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, breaks have helped firefighters protect nearby communities from multiple fires in recent years. Alaska's changing wildfire environment has recommendations and resources for wildfire preparedness. Key resources are initiatives such as FireWise, Community Wildfire Protection Plans, and Ready, Set, Go. There are many ways to prepare for wildfire and to take action to help prepare your community. If you want detailed tips and resources for preparing for wildfire as a homeowner, please check out another AFSC product, McKinley Fire Lessons Learned. This work, led by Jen from the University of Anchorage, is based off of extensive interviews with the residents of the McKinley area and wildfire agency staff. Jen also has an amazing video with interviews of the residents that is available and will be linked in the chat. One section of this publication covers defensible space, something everyone living in the wildland-urban interface should take very seriously. This is a picture of a property that was easy to defend and not lost in the McKinley fire. Compare it to a picture of this property that did not have any defensible space, and a property without defensible space is very hazardous for fire crews to operate within. Before I conclude my presentation, I bet some of you may be wondering, what is in store for this fire season? Well, today I received the latest wildfire outlook from the International Arctic Research Center in NOAA. So far, about 75,000 acres have burned. This is the lowest seasonal total to date since 2008 and the lowest June monthly total since 2014. The red area of the graph represents the 25th to 75th percentile probability for fire for the year. This indicates that a sub 500,000 acre year is highly likely. Combined with the weather outlook for July, it appears that this will most likely be a small fire year. But please take extra precautions on this 4th of July weekend and not start close to home fires. Okay, I'd like to finish this presentation by summarizing a few key messages. Alaska's rapidly changing climate profoundly impacts the state's ecosystems and fire regimes. Most importantly, recognize that wildfire is a natural process that provides ecological benefits. We need to respect wildfire and take action to protect ourselves and our communities from the dangers of wildfire. And finally, be aware that fire in Alaska is intensifying as the climate continues to rapidly warm. With that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. My contact info is available at the top of the slide, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share this information with all of you. And if there's any more questions, I'll address them now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zav. That was really, really interesting. I know I learned a lot. Not looking like there's any additional questions at this time, but we'll stick around for a few more minutes. I really appreciate, again, the presentation and the great conversation today. As a reminder, you can always replay to our attendees, you can always replay this presentation as a subscriber and review any of the past technical sessions in the event hub after you log in. Zav provided his contact information. If you have additional questions, feel free to follow up with him and Allison at any time. Feel free to contact the Alaska Forum with any feedback or ideas and requests for future sessions. As I mentioned at the beginning here, we're going to take a break on the technical sessions for the month of July. and we'll be back in August on the 4th to talk about fungi. So if there's no additional questions, I hope everyone has a great and safe summer. Again, thank you to Zav and Allison for being here today, for the great presentation, the great conversation. And I really feel hopeful after your last couple of slides there, talking about our lower than expected, or than I initially heard of fire season. So thank you for that information and all the other information you provided today.